Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
The papers arrived on a Wednesday morning, sealed in a thick white envelope that looked far too official to be good news. I remember the weight of it, heavier than it should have been, like it already knew it was about to ruin my coffee. At first, I thought it was another investor proposal or some tedious government audit notice. I didn't open it right away. I even set it aside, thinking I'd deal with it after lunch. But curiosity is a cruel habit, and by 10:30, I had the document spread open on my kitchen counter, and my hands had gone cold. My parents were suing me. Not strangers, not competitors, not some greedy shareholders. My parents. Elaine and Victor Morgan, the people who once bought me my first computer and told me I was born to build something, were dragging me to court for ownership of my company. Their signatures were right there, black ink, bold and deliberate. I reread the first page 3 times, hoping there'd been a mistake, a misprint, something that made sense. But every word was as sharp and clear as a knife pressed against my neck. For a few minutes, I just stood there. No sound. No movement. Even the refrigerator seemed to stop humming. I felt like the ground beneath me had quietly given way, and I was just waiting to fall. The company they were trying to steal, my company, wasn't some family inheritance or a shared venture. I had built it from scratch in my late 20s, while they were still telling everyone I was trying to figure myself out. I lived off microwaved noodles and coffee so bitter it could strip paint. I remember working on the prototype in my tiny apartment, my mother calling to remind me that real women knew how to balance work and family. And now here they were, taking the one thing that had ever made me feel like I didn't need their approval to exist. The legal claim was filled with elegant wording, breach of fiduciary duty, failure to honor investor commitments. I could almost hear my father's voice dictating it to his lawyer, trying to sound calm and businesslike, pretending this wasn't personal. But I knew him better. Every word reeked of old resentment, of the humiliation he felt when his daughter succeeded without his money. He'd invested a small sum years ago, not because he believed in me, but because he didn't want to look like the father who doubted his only child. Now he was using that as his claim to my life's work. By noon, I had gone through the whole file twice, highlighting sections in yellow that didn't even need highlighting, just to keep my hands busy. It wasn't just betrayal, it was precision-engineered humiliation. My parents weren't impulsive people. They planned everything, vacations, arguments, even apologies. Which meant this lawsuit had been in motion for months before I found out. I imagined the two of them sitting at their oak dining table, sipping wine, calmly discussing how to cut me out of my own company. I could almost hear my mother saying something like, "It's for her own good. She's too emotional to handle leadership." That was always her favorite line, that I was too emotional. She said it when I cried after being rejected by investors. She said it when I refused to sell the company during its rough patch. I used to think she said it out of care, that she wanted me to be tougher. Now I realized it was her way of making sure I never felt in control of my own story. I called Tyler around 1 o'clock. We'd been best friends since middle school, the kind of friendship that had outlasted bad relationships, job relocations, and one very awkward, almost kiss at 26. He answered on the third ring, his tone casual until he heard the tremor in my voice. "They're suing me," I said. Silence. Then a single word. "Who?" When I told him, I heard him exhale like he'd been punched. "Rachel, are you sure?" he asked. I laughed, a sound halfway between disbelief and hysteria, and said, "I'm looking at their signatures right now." He told me not to panic, that he'd look at the papers, that we'd figure it out. But his voice had that careful lawyer tone, the one that meant this wasn't going to be simple. I trusted him, though. Tyler had seen me at my lowest, once even helped me rebuild the company after a disastrous product launch that nearly bankrupted us. If there was anyone who could help me fight this, it was him. After we hung up, I sat at the counter, staring at the lawsuit again, reading the fine print like it might change if I looked hard enough. The absurdity of it hit me in waves. My parents, who had spent years subtly reminding me that I'd be nothing without them, were now using the system they worshipped, the legal one, the clean, emotionless one, to prove they were right all along. It wasn't even about money. They already had more than they could spend in 2 lifetimes. It was about pride. The kind of pride that eats through family like acid. I tried to eat something that afternoon, but ended up just picking at a cold sandwich while my mind replayed old arguments. My father lecturing me about knowing my place in business. My mother telling me I'd thank them one day for their guidance. I used to think those were just words, the kind every parent throws around when they're scared of losing influence. Now I realized they'd been practicing ownership language for years. This was just the final form of it, legalized love turned into paperwork. By evening, my kitchen was littered with notes, sticky tabs, and printouts. I'd gone from shock to strategy without even noticing. If they wanted a war, I'd give them one, but on my terms. I wasn't going to scream, or beg, or let them frame me as the emotional daughter. No, I was going to let facts, numbers, and evidence do the talking. My mother once told me that control was just confidence with better posture. I smiled at the thought and straightened my back. At 7:30, my phone buzzed, a message from Tyler. I'll review everything tonight. Don't do anything rash. I texted back, too late. Then, as I began sorting the files one last time, I noticed something at the bottom of the lawsuit packet, a letterhead from my former operations manager, dated months before he quit. He was listed as a consultant for my parents' side. My pulse slowed, my mind sharpening in an instant. Of course! They'd been planning this with him all along. He knew every flaw, every vulnerability in my company. That was their inside man. For the first time that day, I felt something close to calm. Betrayal was predictable. Predictable meant manageable. I gathered the papers, placed them neatly in a folder, and whispered to myself, fine. You want to fight? You'll get one. I didn't know yet how far they'd go or how far I would. But I did know one thing. By the time this was over, my parents would remember exactly who they raised. By Friday evening, I had rehearsed the kind of calm that looks like resignation but smells like gasoline, and when my mother texted an invitation to have a civilized family dinner and clear the air, I said yes in the same bright tone she uses when she tells waiters that the soup is lovely before sending it back, because if they wanted a performance, I was prepared to give them a matinee and an evening show, complete with the kind of intermission that makes the audience whisper that something dangerous is about to happen. I arrived early on purpose, because I wanted them to register how unshaken I appeared, how my gray suit felt like armor and my hair was pulled back not for vanity, but for visibility. And I placed my phone face down on the table not because I wouldn't use it, but because I wanted them to notice that I could, at any second, pick it up and turn this private theater into a broadcast. My father launched into a lecture about stewardship, legacy, and fiduciary prudence, words that have no taste until you remember they are often used by people who cannot say out loud that their real addiction is control, while my mother kept reaching to adjust the salt cellar as if the table setting were the true emergency. They told me they were protecting the enterprise from founder volatility, a phrase that would be poetic if it weren't so rehearsed, and I let them talk for several uninterrupted minutes because silence is my favorite kind of cross-examination. Then I asked, gently enough to pass for curiosity, whether protecting the enterprise always required hiring my former operations manager as a consultant months before he resigned, and whether their lawyer found it convenient that his laptop still contained cached credentials for 2 internal dashboards I had quietly retired last quarter. My mother blinked the way she does when her contacts are dry, my father reached for his water, and I knew I had pressed exactly where the bruise lived. I told them a story, because stories tame wild rooms, about the spring I pitched to 22 different investors who all told me I was bright but premature. How I came home to their kitchen where my father said a serious founder would never cry in public, and my mother asked whether I had considered a role that isn't so prone to headlines. And how I learned that the only way to keep my hands steady was to attach them to the wheel, which is why, 6 months ago, I rewrote the voting structure, adjusted the vesting schedule for dormant shares, and moved key patents into a protective subsidiary with an automatic reversion clause triggered by any attempt to reassign control through hostile litigation. I watched the arithmetic crawl across my father's forehead, watched my mother scan for a softer ground that wasn't there, and I did not smile, because winners who smile too soon look like liars. When the entrees arrived, I excused myself to the restroom, stepped into the hallway outside the dining room, and opened a secure folder in my phone, not to check messages from Tyler. Though he had sent a precise list of what a judge would care about and what would be dismissed as family noise, but to cue the first of 3 quiet countermeasures I had prepared for this little dinner. I authorized a statement to a mid-tier industry newsletter that had been breathlessly repeating rumors about my supposed instability. A statement written in the kind of dry corporate tone that terrifies gossips because it carries footnotes and which detailed, without naming names, that an unauthorized third party had attempted to access deprecated internal tools in violation of confidentiality and that the company had already completed an external audit confirming chain of custody integrity. An audit performed by a firm my father respects because he once failed to bully them. Back at the table, I let them float a deal. A buyout that would leave me comfortable and free to pursue creative projects, phrases that belong in retirement brochures and soft-focus commercials for oceanside condos. Then I asked whether comfortable included the non-disparagement language their lawyer had embedded on page 7, which would have prevented me from correcting the record if they continued to imply I was unfit, and I watched my father's jaw hinge the way a drawer does when it meets a lock it didn't know existed. I told them that I couldn't accept the buyout because my board, which they assumed would fold under pressure, had already voted on a contingency resolution last month that barred any transfer of control to parties engaged in active litigation, and my mother said that seemed premature, which is a gracious way of calling your daughter a schemer. And I said that experience has taught me that premeditated harm deserves premeditated safety. The server asked about dessert, and I said yes, not because I wanted it, but because time is a tool, and while the kitchen caramelized something delicate, my phone lit with 2 notifications that I read without moving my lips. First, the newsletter had published the audit statement and was now asking my parents' counsel for comment, and second, the internal security team had confirmed that the former operations manager's credentials had been used 3 separate times last month from an address that matched a guest account at a private club my parents favor, which meant the trail did not only exist, but wore their perfume. I did not present the proof, not yet, because revenge tastes better when the target salts their own plate. So I paid the bill before my father could perform his favorite ritual of flashing the black card like a family crest, and I stood to leave with the kind of politeness that makes people check their pockets, and my small act of revenge, clean, witty, perfectly legal, was already underway. By the time they reached their car, the story would no longer be about an emotional founder, but about a procedural breach that competent adults had failed to avoid. Their consultant would be calling to ask why. His name was trending in a corner of the internet he cannot control, and the audit firm would have forwarded a courtesy note to the court clerk indicating that any injunction sought against my leadership should account for the possibility of compromised evidence chains. On the sidewalk, my mother touched my arm and said we could still fix this if I stopped letting outsiders mislead me, a sentence so perfectly upside down that it almost made me laugh, and I told her in a level voice that I wasn't misled. I was merely finished pretending that love and ownership are synonyms. Then I stepped into the night air that felt like the first honest breath I had taken in weeks, and as I walked away my phone buzzed again, this time with a short message from Tyler that didn't bother with greetings. Hearing a signed, Monday morning, you will not believe who drew the bench, and I kept walking because the world had just tilted, and for once it felt like it might be tilting in my direction. The weekend passed in a blur of quiet preparation, a strange combination of patience and adrenaline that left me simultaneously exhausted and impossibly alert, because every phone call, every email, every spreadsheet I opened seemed to carry the weight of my entire life, and I knew that the slightest misstep could turn months of careful planning into fodder for my parents' smug satisfaction. I moved through my apartment with the methodical precision of someone arranging chess pieces before a high-stakes match, even as my mind replayed every interaction, every subtle manipulation my parents had ever deployed. And I realized that this was the culmination of a pattern that had started long before the lawsuit, their constant need to assert dominance, to remind me that my successes were not entirely my own, to weave a narrative in which my intelligence was tolerated but never celebrated. The irony was that the very traits they had criticized, the relentless attention to detail, the insistence on foresight, the ability to anticipate consequences before they manifested, were now the tools I would use to dismantle the carefully constructed illusion of control they thought they possessed. I spent hours with Laura, my chief financial officer, who had been my closest confidant for nearly a decade, going through contracts, emails, and internal communications, searching for anything that could expose the cracks in my parents' arguments and the complicity of the former operations manager who had once been considered trustworthy. We discovered small anomalies that had been deliberately buried, like subtle discrepancies in the dates of equity transfers and signatures that were slightly misaligned, details so minute that a casual observer would dismiss them. But to someone trained to read the language of corporate documents, they screamed intentional manipulation. We cataloged each item meticulously, preparing a dossier that was both a defensive shield and a silent message that while they had underestimated me, they had underestimated my capacity for patience and strategic foresight. Meanwhile, my parents began to maneuver openly, attempting to sway investors and board members with carefully curated narratives about my supposed instability, and it became clear that they believed my absence from public engagement was weakness, that my calm, reserved demeanor was compliance. I allowed them the illusion of control, attending to my daily responsibilities with deliberate normalcy while cultivating the quiet strength of invisibility. A strategy one had learned long ago in negotiations where visibility often invites attack and discretion preserves power. Each time a rumor surfaced, I countered it not with confrontation but with evidence, a subtle, precise, irrefutable trail that showed that every claim they made could be dissected and neutralized without ever appearing reactive, because in litigation, perception often carries as much weight as fact, and I intended to master both. Tyler and I communicated constantly, sometimes exchanging dense paragraphs that dissected legal strategy, sometimes speaking in careful shorthand about potential courtroom contingencies, and every conversation reinforced the gravity of the situation while highlighting the immense advantage we held through preparation and clarity of purpose. He reminded me that the judge assigned to the case would not tolerate theatrics, that emotional appeals would fall flat unless backed by incontrovertible documentation, and that my parents' attempt to frame me as unfit would falter under a meticulous presentation of timelines, evidence, and structural safeguards I had already implemented in anticipation of possible conflict. Each piece of information was a weapon, each fact a potential pivot, and I began to see the entire lawsuit not as a threat but as a stage on which I could orchestrate the truth with surgical precision. In parallel, I maintained my outward composure in the world, attending meetings, reviewing investor reports, and keeping up appearances as if nothing extraordinary were happening, a performance designed to lull my parents into overconfidence. Because arrogance can be exploited, and they were already overconfident in their ability to sway perception through subtle social pressure and financial influence. I mapped the courtroom in my mind, imagined each chair, each desk, the angles from which my parents would attempt to assert authority, and the exact sequence in which each piece of evidence would be most devastating, building in my head a strategy that was equal parts legal acumen and psychological insight. Late Sunday evening, a message from Tyler arrived, simple but loaded with implication. Judge Ross drew the bench. Prepare for precision, not theatrics. I stared at the text, feeling a combination of relief and anticipation, because I knew that the individual assigned would not be swayed by intimidation, social standing, or familial pressure, but would instead focus on substance, on evidence, on the integrity of the claims, and in that knowledge lay the first taste of satisfaction, the quiet anticipation of vindication that comes when preparation meets circumstance. As I organized the documents one last time before bed, reviewing each spreadsheet, each email chain, each contract clause, I understood that the real battle had already begun, not in the courtroom, but in the deliberate cultivation of certainty, patience, and awareness. Because while my parents had assumed that their aggression, their strategic manipulation, and their years of experience with influence would carry the day, they had failed to anticipate the quiet, unrelenting diligence of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to see the moves before they were made. By the time Monday arrived, the stage would be set, the actors in place, and every piece of evidence, every meticulous note, every subtle, unnoticed maneuver would converge to ensure that the truth, finally, would speak louder than arrogance, history, or familial expectation. Monday morning arrived with a sharp clarity that made every detail of the courthouse seem monumental, from the polished wooden floors that reflected the overhead light like a mirror to the heavy, brass-handled doors that swung open with a deliberate authority. And as I stepped inside, the air carried a mixture of formal restraint and unspoken tension, the kind of tension that presses on your lungs and reminds you that this is not just a room, but a stage where the culmination of months of careful preparation, quiet strategy, and restrained fury would be tested against the arrogance and entitlement of the very people who had once told you that your place was always secondary. The courthouse smelled faintly of old books and varnish, a reminder that legal battles are steeped not only in law but in tradition, and as I walked past the benches where spectators would sit, I noticed the subtle glances from other litigants, the whispered speculation about the high-profile nature of the case. And I felt a mixture of dread and exhilaration because every eye in the room could become a witness to the unraveling of a long-held illusion. My parents were already there, seated near the front, their posture rigid and their expressions calculated to convey control and confidence, and I recognized in their movements the choreography of people who have spent years performing authority. The careful alignment of shoulders, the subtle glance that signals dominance without needing words, yet beneath the surface, in the slight twitch of my mother's hand and the tightening of my father's jaw, I saw the first cracks of apprehension, the recognition that their plan, as meticulously constructed as it was, had not accounted for the possibility that I would be equally prepared, equally deliberate, and armed not with emotion but with irrefutable facts and a relentless understanding of every angle, every contingency, every line of attack that could be deployed. Tyler sat a few rows behind me, quiet and observant, his presence a steady reassurance that despite the theater of intimidation my parents attempted to stage, I was not alone, and the subtle exchange of a nod between us conveyed volumes without uttering a single word, a silent acknowledgement that we were aligned in purpose and strategy. The bailiff's voice echoed through the chamber, commanding attention as he announced the entrance of the judge, and the room rose in unison. A ritual that signaled both respect and the latent power of the individual who would decide not only the immediate outcome of this case, but, symbolically, the hierarchy of authority within the family itself. Because nothing is more psychologically potent than witnessing your presumed superiority questioned by an impartial arbiter whose decisions carry the weight of law and the subtle, ineffable authority that comes from years of mastering both precedent and human temperament. As the judge walked in, every step measured and deliberate, the air shifted, and in that shift, my parents' expressions transformed from quiet triumph to an almost imperceptible panic. A recognition that the person presiding over their ambitions was someone whose judgment could not be swayed by familiarity, favoritism, or social standing, and in that moment, I understood that the scales of this confrontation had already begun to tilt. Judge Ross, whose presence I had only ever experienced outside the constraints of formal authority, settled into his chair with a gravity that made the room feel smaller, more focused, and as he opened the file before him, his eyes scanned the documentation with meticulous attention, pausing occasionally in a way that suggested not surprise but a measured assessment, as though he were constructing an internal map of the arguments, the evidence, and the potential strategies employed by both sides, and I recognized in those pauses the quiet menace of intellectual precision, the kind that makes bluffing impossible and exposes every assumption, every overconfidence, and every misrepresentation with surgical clarity. My parents began their presentation, their voices polished and rehearsed, attempting to frame the narrative in terms that emphasized legality and propriety. Yet every claim they made was countered silently by the weight of prior documentation I had carefully assembled, each piece a reflection of months of anticipation, preparation, and strategic foresight. And I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that their veneer of control was fragile, vulnerable to collapse under the exact scrutiny that Judge Ross was applying, because law, unlike family dynamics, does not defer to legacy or entitlement, but to evidence, logic, and the precision of process. When the first challenge to their claims was raised, pointing to inconsistencies and procedural irregularities, I watched their confidence waver, subtle but unmistakable, as the reality of exposure dawned. And while their lawyer attempted to redirect attention, the judge's queries were precise, targeted, and unflinching, dismantling assumptions and demanding clarity, leaving no room for ambiguity or evasion. And I felt the culmination of my long game begin to materialize as an unassailable truth, silently observed by all in attendance, yet revealed only through the methodical unraveling of deception, with each piece of evidence and every factual clarification constructing an inevitable trajectory toward accountability and resolution. The courtroom air seemed to thicken with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were aware of the gravity of what was unfolding, and as the hearing progressed, every glance my parents exchanged carried a new dimension of panic and disbelief. An unspoken acknowledgement that their carefully orchestrated plan was being undone not by passion, not by confrontation, but by the unyielding precision of preparation, the deliberate accumulation of facts, and the presence of a judge whose integrity and insight left no space for manipulation or theatrics. And I realized, as the hours passed in this tense, meticulous display, that the stage had been set for a revelation that would forever alter the dynamics not only of the courtroom but of the relationships that had seemed immutable, exposing the true measure of loyalty, strategy, and foresight. The courtroom settled into a tense stillness as the final arguments concluded, and in that heavy quiet, I felt the culmination of months of preparation, strategy, and quiet observation converging into a single, inevitable moment that would determine not only the legal fate of my company, but the fragile dynamics of authority, pride, and perception that had governed my family for decades. And as Judge Ross leaned forward to address the room, the weight of his presence seemed to compress the air, making every whisper, every suppressed movement, every twitch of a hand or tightening of a jaw resonate with amplified significance, because in this space, the veneer of confidence my parents had cultivated was meaningless against the precision, integrity, and discerning scrutiny of someone who commanded both law and moral authority without ever needing to raise a voice. When my lawyer presented the first piece of evidence, a meticulously documented timeline that exposed the deliberate manipulations of the signatures, dates, and corporate transfers my parents had orchestrated, I watched as Elaine's composed mask faltered ever so slightly, her eyes flicking to Victor with a mixture of disbelief and the faint, instinctive panic that arises when a plan built on control and assumed superiority begins to unravel in real time. And the courtroom seemed to breathe with anticipation, aware that the carefully constructed narrative of family loyalty and founder volatility was being methodically dismantled by logic, fact, and preparation. A combination so simple yet so devastating that it required nothing more than truth to wield its full impact. Victor attempted to interject, to frame the argument as a matter of legacy and responsibility, invoking a language of entitlement and expectation that he believed would resonate with the bench. But Judge Ross, with a steady and unwavering focus, allowed no diversion, parsing each claim with deliberate attention, questioning the validity of the documents, the timing of transfers, and the motivations behind every action. And in the clarity of his inquiries, it became evident that the room was witnessing not just a legal proceeding, but the collapse of decades of assumed authority, the quiet revelation that control, no matter how long it has been exercised, is vulnerable when confronted with preparation, foresight, and the impartial application of principle. As testimony unfolded, the former operations manager's involvement became increasingly exposed, his role as an intermediary for my parents' strategy laid bare in a way that left no ambiguity. Every memorandum, every email chain, every cached file contributing to a mosaic that reflected both deliberate intention and complicity, and the subtle expressions that passed across my parents' faces indicated the dawning realization that not only had they underestimated my vigilance, but they had also failed to anticipate the thoroughness of the evidence that would strip away their claims piece by piece, leaving them reliant solely on arguments that no longer held weight in the presence of documented reality. The judge's voice, calm and deliberate, carried through the chamber with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation, addressing each point with measured reasoning, clarifying the definitions of ownership, control, and fiduciary responsibility, and methodically dismantling the assertion that I had somehow forfeited authority or mismanaged the assets entrusted to my oversight, while simultaneously underscoring that the integrity of corporate governance requires not only formal documentation but a consistent alignment with truth, transparency, and accountability, principles that my parents had clearly neglected in their pursuit of dominance. And as his words settled over the room, a quiet but undeniable tension took hold, a realization that their assumptions of influence, manipulation, and privilege would be insufficient to secure the outcome they had imagined. When the verdict was finally announced, dismissing the claims and affirming my control over the company, I remained seated, allowing the impact to register in its full dimension, observing the disorientation etched into the faces of Elaine and Victor, the subtle collapse of postures that had long projected authority, and the faint but perceptible shift in the dynamics of power that the courtroom had facilitated, because their expectation of triumph had been replaced by the disquieting recognition that control cannot be claimed through coercion, pretense, or privilege, but must be earned, maintained, and demonstrated through consistent, deliberate action aligned with truth, a principle that my parents had ignored at their own peril. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun reflected against the glass of the city buildings as I walked with Tyler, the weight of the day still pressing in the form of adrenaline and satisfaction, and when he finally broke the silence with a quiet, "You handled that brilliantly," I allowed a smile to cross my face, not from vanity but from the satisfaction of having navigated a landscape fraught with manipulation and personal history, emerging not only victorious but intact, with the knowledge that the outcome had been shaped by patience, preparation, and a steadfast commitment to integrity. That night, alone in my office overlooking the city's skyline, I reviewed the case materials one last time, the images of the courtroom, the measured tone of Judge Ross, and the subtle but undeniable shift in my parents' demeanor replaying in my mind. And as I sipped a cup of coffee that had grown cold during the day, a message appeared on my phone from Tyler. "Your parents are lucky it was me." I set the phone down and allowed the tension to drain slowly, understanding that the resolution was complete, the lesson delivered, yet the implications lingered in a quiet, reflective space, a reminder that vigilance, foresight, and calm decisiveness are the instruments of lasting influence, and that sometimes the most satisfying victories are those achieved without a single raised voice, a single act of malice, but through the unyielding power of preparation, principle, and patience, leaving both triumph and reflection in their wake.